The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape just outside the small frontier town of Copper Ridge. The year was 1887, and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered sagebrush and the occasional twisted mesquite tree. Sarah McKenna's hands were raw and bleeding, her fingernails caked with dirt and her own blood. She'd been digging for hours, using a rusted spade she'd found abandoned near the old mining claim. Her dark hair, usually pinned neatly beneath her bonnet, hung in disheveled strands around her face. Damp with sweat and tears, she refused to acknowledge. The hole in the ground was barely 3 feet deep, not nearly enough for what she needed to bury. But every muscle in her 19-year-old body screamed in protest, and her hands shook from exhaustion and grief. The bundle wrapped in her mother's quilt lay nearby, small and still, under the relentless sun. "Come on, Sarah," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse from the dry air and unshed sobs. "Just a little deeper." She had left Copper Ridge before dawn, unable to bear the pitying looks of the townspeople or the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Her younger brother, Tommy, had succumbed to the fever that had swept through the town like wildfire, taking nearly a dozen children in its wake. Their parents had died the previous winter in a wagon accident, leaving Sarah alone to care for the only family she had left. Now she had no one. The spade struck something hard. Rock, probably. Sarah fell to her knees and began clawing at the earth with her bare hands, desperate to make the grave deeper, proper, worthy of the little boy who had been her whole world for the past 8 months. "Please," she gasped, though she wasn't sure who she was pleading with. God had seemed absent from her life for quite some time now. That's when she heard it, the soft sound of a horse's hooves on the dusty ground behind her. Sarah's blood ran cold. Out here, alone and vulnerable, a woman was easy prey for outlaws, drifters, or worse. She'd brought her father's old Colt revolver, but it lay several feet away, wrapped in the same bundle as her few remaining possessions. Slowly she turned around, shielding her eyes from the sun. A lone rider sat motionless on his horse about 30 yards away. He was Apache. She could tell by his long black hair, the beaded band around his forehead, and the way he sat his horse like he was born to it. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, lean and weathered by sun and wind. His dark eyes were fixed on her, but his expression was unreadable. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The Apache wars might have officially ended, but tensions still ran high throughout the territory. Many white settlers still viewed any Apache with suspicion and fear, and Sarah had heard enough stories to know that a lone woman would be considered easy prey. But something in his posture wasn't threatening. He made no move toward her, didn't reach for any weapons. He simply sat and watched, as still as the desert landscape around them. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the empty space. The wind picked up, swirling dust devils across the hardpan and rustling the dry grass. Sarah could feel sweat trickling down her spine, mixing with the dust and grime that covered her from head to toe. Then, without a word, the Apache dismounted. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to stay still. Running would be useless. His horse could easily outpace her on foot, and she was already exhausted from hours of digging. Instead, she watched as he approached slowly, his moccasined feet making barely a sound on the rocky ground. He stopped at the edge of the shallow grave and looked down at the pitiful hole she'd managed to scratch out of the unforgiving earth. His gaze moved to the wrapped bundle, then back to her blood-streaked hands and dirt-stained dress. Sarah waited for him to speak, to make some demand or threat. Instead, he walked back to his horse and untied something from his saddle, a proper shovel, its wooden handle worn smooth from use. He returned to the gravesite and, without looking at her, began to dig. Sarah stared in complete bewilderment. The rhythmic sound of the shovel biting into the earth filled the air, efficient and strong, where her desperate clawing had been weak and frantic. Within minutes, He had deepened the grave more than she had managed in hours. Why? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. He paused in his digging and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and held a depth of understanding that made her chest tighten. He didn't answer her question. Perhaps he didn't speak English, or perhaps he simply chose not to. Instead, he returned to his work. Sarah found herself moving closer, picking up her own rusted spade. Side by side, they dug in the desert silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal against stone, and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the grave was finally deep enough. The Apache stepped back and leaned on his shovel, breathing hard from the exertion. Sarah looked down at their work, clean, proper, respectful. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible above the evening wind. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. Then he helped her lower the small bundle into the earth, his movements gentle and reverent. As Sarah began to cover her brother with handfuls of dirt, the Apache continued using the shovel, making the task quicker and less agonizing. When it was finished, they stood on opposite sides of the fresh mound of earth. Sarah had expected to feel some sense of closure, of completion. Instead, the reality of her absolute aloneness crashed over her like a physical blow. She swayed on her feet, suddenly dizzy from exhaustion and grief and the crushing weight of her solitude. The Apache was watching her with those dark, knowing eyes. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he walked back to his horse and began unsaddling the animal for the night. He was staying. Sarah woke to the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind. She was lying on hard ground, covered by her father's old coat, and her body ached in places she'd forgotten existed. Then memory came flooding back, and with it the crushing weight of her new reality. She sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. The Apache was crouched beside a small fire about 10 feet away, tending to something in a metal pot that must have come from his pack. His horse was hobbled nearby, grazing on the sparse desert grass. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. He looked up as she stirred, and Sarah was struck again by the calm intelligence in his dark eyes. Without a word, he ladled something from the pot into a tin cup and held it out to her. Sarah hesitated. She had been raised on stories of savage Indians who couldn't be trusted, who would torture and kill white settlers without mercy. But this man had helped her bury her brother, had stayed through the night without making any threatening moves. And the smell of whatever he was offering made her stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning. She reached out and took the cup. The metal was warm against her palms, and steam rose from the dark liquid inside. It was some kind of soup or stew, with bits of what looked like meat and roots floating in a rich broth. She took a tentative sip and was surprised by the complex, earthy flavor. "It's good," she said softly. "Thank you." He nodded and returned to his own cup. They ate in silence as the sun climbed higher, chasing away the desert chill. Sarah found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companion. His skin was weathered and scarred in places. An old knife wound across his left forearm, a puckered bullet scar on his shoulder. His hair was longer than any white man would wear, hanging past his shoulders and held back by a beaded band that looked like it might have been made by a woman's hands. When they finished eating, he efficiently cleaned the pot and cups, using sand and a small amount of water from his canteen. Sarah watched the economical way he moved, wasting nothing, making every motion count. It was clear he was used to living rough, to making do with whatever the desert provided. "I should head back to town," Sarah said, though the words felt hollow. The truth was, she had nowhere to go. The small house she'd shared with Tommy would feel like a tomb now, and she had barely enough money to last a week, let alone start over somewhere else. The Apache was rolling up his blankets, preparing to pack his horse. He paused and looked at her with that same measuring gaze, as if he could see right through her brave words to the terror underneath. He said something in his own language. The first time she'd heard him speak, the words were soft and melodic, nothing like the harsh, guttural sounds she'd expected from Apache speech. When she looked confused, he tried again in broken English. "Where you go?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Back to Copper Ridge, I suppose. I have a house there." She didn't mention that the house would feel empty and haunted, or that she had no idea how she would survive on her own. He nodded slowly, then gestured toward the grave with one weathered hand. "Who?" "My brother." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Tommy, he was only 7. Something shifted in the Apache's expression, a softening around the eyes that spoke of understanding too deep for words. He said something else in his native tongue, and though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakably one of sympathy and respect. They stood in silence for a long moment, the desert wind whispering around them. Sarah knew she should start the long walk back to town, but something kept her rooted in place. This stranger had shown her more kindness in the past 12 hours than anyone in Copper Ridge had in months. The thought of returning to that world of pitying looks and awkward silences felt almost unbearable. "I don't even know your name," she said suddenly. He studied her for a moment, then placed a hand on his chest. "Nalnish." The word rolled off his tongue like water over stones. "Nalnish," Sarah repeated, trying to match his pronunciation. "I'm Sarah. Sarah McKenna." He nodded. Sarah. Her name sounded different in his voice, more musical somehow. Nalnish finished packing his horse and swung up into the saddle with easy grace. For a moment Sarah thought he was simply going to ride away, leaving her alone with her grief and her impossible decisions. Instead, he maneuvered his horse closer and extended his hand down to her. Sarah stared at the offered hand, her mind racing. Getting on that horse would mean crossing a line she could never uncross. It would mean trusting her life to a man she'd known for less than a day, a man whose people were still viewed as enemies by most whites in the territory. It would mean abandoning everything familiar, even if that familiarity was poisoned by sorrow. But as she looked back at the small grave mound, at the desolate landscape that stretched endlessly toward Copper Ridge, Sarah realized she had already lost everything that mattered. What did she have left to lose? She reached up and took his hand. His grip was strong and calloused, and he pulled her up behind him with surprising gentleness. The horse shifted under the added weight, but stood steady. Sarah had ridden before, but never like this, never pressed against a stranger's back, never with her arms wrapped around someone who should have been her enemy. "Where are we going?" she asked, as Nalnish urged the horse into motion. He turned his head slightly, and she caught a glimpse of what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Safe place," he said in his careful English. "My people." Sarah's stomach dropped. His people, an Apache camp. She was voluntarily riding into what most whites would consider certain death or worse. But as the horse carried them away from the gravesite and deeper into the vast desert, Sarah found that her fear was mixed with something else she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe she was making the biggest mistake of her life, but for the first time since her parents died, she wasn't facing the future alone. The Apache camp materialized out of the desert landscape like something from a dream. Sarah had expected teepees and war paint, the savage imagery that filled the penny novels and newspaper stories back east. Instead, she found herself looking at a small cluster of traditional brush shelters, wickiups, nestled in a hidden canyon where a thin stream provided precious water and cottonwood trees offered shade. There were perhaps 20 people in the camp, mostly women, children, and elderly men. As Nalnish's horse picked its way down the narrow trail into the canyon, Sarah felt dozens of eyes watching their approach. The conversations around the various fires died away, replaced by a tense silence that made her stomach clench with anxiety. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger wickiups, her grey hair braided and adorned with turquoise beads. Her weathered face was stern as she spoke rapidly to Nalnish in Apache, her voice rising with what was clearly displeasure. Sarah caught the word Indar. She'd heard it before, and knew it meant white person in a way that wasn't exactly friendly. Nalnish dismounted and helped Sarah down, his movements calm despite the obvious tension. He spoke quietly to the elderly woman, his tone respectful but firm. Sarah stood awkwardly beside the horse, acutely aware of how she must look, dirty, exhausted, and completely out of place in her torn dress and dust-covered boots. More people began to gather around them. Sarah saw curiosity in some faces, suspicion in others. A few of the children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, their dark eyes wide with fascination at seeing a white woman in their hidden sanctuary. The elderly woman, clearly someone of importance in the camp, continued her heated discussion with Nalnish. Sarah caught fragments of English mixed in with the Apache words, dangerous, soldiers, trouble. It didn't take much imagination to understand the gist of the argument. Finally, a man stepped forward from the crowd. He was older than Nalnish, perhaps in his 40s, with greying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. When he spoke, it was in clear, careful English. "I am Cochise' son, Taza," he said, his dark eyes studying Sarah intently. "Nalnish tells us you have suffered loss. You have nowhere to go." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The name Cochise sent a chill down her spine. Even she knew the reputation of the legendary Apache war chief, though he had died over a decade earlier. "My grandmother, Dostese, says you bring danger to our people," Taza continued, gesturing toward the elderly woman. "White soldiers look for reasons to attack us. A missing white woman would give them such a reason." "I'm not missing," Sarah said quickly. "I mean, no one will be looking for me. There's no one left to look." The words hung in the air, a stark admission of her complete isolation. Taza's expression softened slightly, but Dostese muttered something that sounded decidedly uncomplimentary. Nalnish spoke again, his voice low and intense. Sarah heard her name mixed in with the Apache words, and something about digging and brother. He was telling them about Tommy, she realized, about finding her alone in the desert, trying to bury her only family. The mood of the crowd began to shift. Sarah saw understanding dawn in several faces and heard murmurs of what sounded like sympathy. Among the Apache, family bonds were sacred, and the loss of a child was a grief that transcended cultural boundaries. A young woman about Sarah's age stepped forward, carrying a baby on her hip. She said something to Nalnish in Apache, her voice gentle but concerned. He nodded and replied, then turned to Sarah. "Ayana asks if you are hurt," he translated. "She is medicine woman, healer." Sarah looked down at her hands, still raw and bloody from the previous day's digging. "Just my hands. I'm fine." But Ayana was already approaching, setting her baby down carefully before reaching for Sarah's hands. Her touch was gentle as she examined the torn skin and dirt-crusted cuts. She clicked her tongue disapprovingly and called out to someone in the crowd. An older woman hurried over with a pottery bowl filled with water and some kind of plant material. Ayana began cleaning Sarah's wounds with careful efficiency, speaking softly to her in Apache. The tone was comforting, almost maternal, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, despite the strangeness of the situation. "She says your hands will heal," Nalnish translated. "But you must rest." "Let them rest." Taza was conferring quietly with Dostese and several other adults. Finally, he turned back to Sarah and Nalnish. "You may stay," he said slowly, "but only for a few days, until your hands heal and you decide where you will go. We cannot risk harboring you longer than that." Dostese obviously disagreed with the decision, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she turned and stalked back to her wickiup, muttering under her breath. "Do not mind my grandmother," Taza said with the hint of a smile. "She has lived through many wars, seen much death caused by misunderstanding between our peoples. She fears for the young ones." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. "I don't want to bring trouble to anyone. I didn't know where else to go." Ayana finished bandaging Sarah's hands with strips of soft hide and some kind of healing salve that smelled of sage and other desert plants. She smiled and spoke again in Apache. "She says you will sleep in her wiki up," Nalnish translated. "Her husband is away, hunting. She has room." The rest of the day passed in a blur of new experiences. Ayana showed Sarah how the wiki-ups were constructed. Dome-shaped frames of oak or willow poles covered with bear grass, yucca fibers, and brush. They were surprisingly comfortable inside, cool in the heat of the day, and well ventilated. Sarah helped with simple tasks around the camp, gathering firewood, fetching water from the stream, watching the children while their mothers worked. The work was different from anything she'd done in Copper Ridge, but it felt good to be useful, to contribute something, instead of just accepting charity. As evening approached, the camp came alive with the sounds of families gathering for the evening meal. Sarah found herself sitting beside Ayana's small fire, sharing a meal of roasted rabbit, wild onions, and some kind of bread made from acorn flour. Nalnish sat across from them, speaking quietly with Ayana in their native language. "What are they saying?" Sarah asked during a lull in the conversation. Nalnish looked at her thoughtfully. "She asks about your family, your people, why you are alone." Sarah's throat tightened. She had been avoiding thinking about her future, focusing instead on the immediate strangeness of her situation. But Ayana's question forced her to confront the reality of her circumstances. "I told you about Tommy," she said quietly. "My parents died last winter. There's no other family, no one else. I have a house in Copper Ridge, but—" She trailed off, unable to explain how empty and haunted that house felt now. Nalnish translated for Ayana, who listened intently and then spoke at length, her voice growing animated. Sarah caught a few words that sounded familiar. "Sister, mother, family." "What is she saying?" Sarah asked. Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "She says, among our people, family is not only blood. Sometimes the spirits bring together people who need each other. She says you have the heart of someone who has lost much, but still has love to give." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't understand." "She asks if you would consider staying longer, learning our ways. There is always need for willing hands, for someone who knows both worlds." Nalnish paused, his dark eyes studying her face. "But it would not be easy. You would have to leave your old life behind, become someone new." Sarah looked around the camp, at the people who had welcomed a stranger despite their own fears and losses. She thought about Copper Ridge, about the empty house, and the pitying looks, and the crushing loneliness that waited for her there. "What would happen to me if I stayed?" she asked. "You would learn," Nalnish said simply. "You would become part of the family." "But Sarah—" He leaned forward, his expression serious. "If soldiers come, if there is trouble, you would be Apache, not white. Do you understand what that means?" Sarah did understand. She would be giving up not just her old life, but her identity, her safety, her place in the white world. If she was discovered, she would be considered a traitor by her own people. And if the camp was attacked, she would share whatever fate befell the rest of them. It should have been a terrifying prospect. Instead, as Sarah looked into Nalnish's steady gaze and felt Ayana's gentle hand on her shoulder, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of belonging somewhere. "I need to think," she said finally. Nalnish nodded. "Of course, but do not think too long. Tomorrow we move camp. It is not safe to stay in one place." As the fire died down and the camp settled into sleep, Sarah lay on the soft bed of rabbit fur that Ayana had prepared for her. Through the opening of the wiki-up, she could see stars blazing in the clear desert sky, more stars than she had ever seen from town. In the distance, she could hear someone singing softly in Apache, a haunting melody that seemed to capture all the loneliness and beauty of the desert night. The sound wrapped around her like a lullaby, and for the first time since Tommy's death, Sarah felt something approaching peace. But she knew that peace came with a price, one that would change everything about who she was and who she might become. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of the camp being dismantled around her. Through the opening of Ayana's wiki-up, she could see people moving efficiently in the grey pre-dawn light, taking down shelters and packing belongings onto horses and travois. There was no rushed panic, just the practiced movements of people who had done this countless times before. Ayana appeared with a cup of pine needle tea and some dried meat. "Eat quickly," Nalnish said, crouching beside the entrance. "We move soon." Sarah's heart clenched. In all her thinking the night before, she hadn't fully grasped how immediate her decision would need to be. "Where are you going?" "Higher into the mountains. There are signs that soldiers have been asking questions in the settlements. About Apache movements." His dark eyes were serious. "About a missing white woman." Sarah's blood ran cold. "I told you, no one will be looking for me." "Perhaps. But someone noticed you were gone. Someone talked." Nalnish's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. "Taza says we cannot risk it. If you are coming with us, you come now. If not..." He didn't need to finish. If she wasn't coming, she would need to find her own way back to Copper Ridge, back to her empty house, an empty life, back to being Sarah McKenna, the tragic orphan girl who had lost everything. Sarah looked around the wiki-up that had sheltered her for just one night. Her few possessions, the bundle she had brought from town, sat in the corner, pitifully small. Everything she owned in the world could fit in a single pack. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what happens to Sarah McKenna?" Nalnish understood what she was really asking. She disappears into the desert. She becomes someone new, someone Apache. Ayana had been listening to their conversation, and now she spoke rapidly in her native language. Nalnish translated, "She says she dreamed about you last night. In the dream, you were grinding corn with her grandmother, speaking our language, singing our songs. She believes it was a vision of what could be." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to imagine herself in 5 years, 10 years. Would she even remember what it felt like to be the girl who had lived in Copper Ridge? Would she still grieve for Tommy, for her parents, for the life she had lost? Outside, she could hear horses being saddled and the last of the wiki-ups being collapsed. Time was running out. "There's something else," Nalnish said quietly. "Something I must tell you before you decide." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him. There was something different in his expression, more personal, more vulnerable. "In my dream last night, I saw you too," he said. "But in my dream, you were not alone. You were with me, as my wife." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, her heart beginning to race. She had noticed the way Naalnish looked at her, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her. But this was the first time either of them had acknowledged the current that had been building between them since that first moment by the grave. "I would not ask you to stay only for me," he continued. "That would not be fair. But if you choose to come, to become Apache, I would like to court you properly, the way my people do." Sarah stared at him. This man who had appeared in her darkest moment, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. She thought about the way he had helped her bury Tommy without being asked, the way he had stayed through the night to protect her, the quiet strength and dignity he carried himself with. "Nalnish," Taza's voice called from outside. "Time to go." Sarah looked into Nalnish's dark eyes and saw her future reflected there, not the future she had planned or expected, but a future that was entirely possible. A life so different from anything she had ever imagined that it seemed like stepping into another world entirely. "If I say yes," she whispered, "I can never go back, can I?" "No," he said honestly, "you cannot." Sarah McKenna would be gone forever. Sarah took a shaky breath. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp preparing to move out. In a few minutes they would be gone, disappearing into the vast desert like they had never existed. And she would be left to find her way back to a life that no longer fit her, to a world where she would always be the girl who had lost everything. Or she could choose something else, entirely. Sarah reached into her bundle and pulled out the small daguerreotype of her family, the only photograph they had ever had taken, all four of them stiff and serious in their Sunday best. For a moment she traced her finger over Tommy's young face, her parents' proud expressions. Then she kissed the photograph gently and handed it to Nalnish. "Keep this safe for me," she said. "I want to remember where I came from, even if I can never go back." He took the photograph with careful hands, understanding immediately what her gesture meant. "And yes," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, "yes, I would like you to court me, properly, the Apache way." The smile that spread across Nalnish's face was like sunrise breaking over the desert. He reached out and touched her bandaged hand gently, a promise and a blessing all at once. Outside, Ayana called her name, not Sarah, but something that sounded like music in the Apache language. Her new name, Sarah realized, the name of the person she was about to become. As they emerged from the wickiup together, Sarah saw that a horse had been prepared for her, a gentle mare with kind eyes and a blanket saddle that looked comfortable enough for long travel. Ayana was waiting beside it with a traveling pack and what looked like Apache clothing, a long dress made of soft deerskin moccasins and a belt decorated with silver conchos. "For later," Nalnish explained. "When you are ready." Sarah nodded, understanding that changing clothes would be just the first of many transformations she would undergo. As she mounted her horse and fell into line with the rest of the traveling party, she felt like she was shedding her old skin and growing a new one. The sun was rising as they rode out of the hidden canyon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Sarah turned back once to look at the place where she had spent her first night as part of an Apache family. Tomorrow night, they would camp somewhere else entirely, and she would be one day further from the girl who had buried her brother in the desert dust. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following trails that were invisible to Sarah's untrained eyes, Nalnish rode beside her. He pointed out landmarks, taught her Apache words for the things they saw, mountain, sky, horse, family. Each new word felt like a key to a door she was just beginning to open. "Are you afraid?" he asked, as they paused to rest the horses at midday. Sarah considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said, "but not of you, not of this." She gestured to encompass the mountains, the people around them, the journey they were undertaking. "I'm afraid of forgetting who I was, of dishonoring my family's memory." Nalnish was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle in the blue sky above them. "My grandmother always said that we carry the spirits of our ancestors with us wherever we go. You will not forget your family. You will honor them by living, by finding joy again, by becoming the person they would want you to be." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, but they were different tears than the ones she had cried over Tommy's grave. These were tears of release, of letting go, of saying goodbye to one life and hello to another. As they remounted and continued their journey deeper into the Apache homeland, Sarah felt the last threads connecting her to Sarah McKenna beginning to fray and break. Behind her lay Copper Ridge, the empty house, the graveyard where her parents rested beside strangers. Ahead lay a future she couldn't imagine, in a world she was only beginning to understand. But for the first time in months, she wasn't facing that future alone. And as Nalnish began teaching her a traditional Apache song about new beginnings, Sarah found herself humming along, her voice joining with his and rising into the endless desert sky. The young woman who had been digging a grave in the dust was gone. In her place rode someone new, someone who belonged to the wind and the mountains and the people who had welcomed her home.